The Flying Dutchman by Heinrich Smidt. High on the waves, the mighty hull of an East Indiaman, who was opposite the board, moved quietly and eerily. For 3 days he had struggled in vain with a calm. The barely filled upper sails did not move him much, and the fierce current of the sea drove him irresistibly sideways. 100 eyes hung on the blue sky to see if there was not a little cloud to be seen somewhere, from which one could hope to be rescued from the ever-increasing danger. But it was clear and transparent and reflected in the smooth sea. A gloomy spirit of displeasure, which had a more hidden cause than that of the calm, dominated the ship, which bore the name of Gelderland, and was the pride of the Dutch East Indian merchant fleet. The evil spirit who had driven peace out of his cabins, and from his deck was the captain of them, Mynheer Klaas van Bellum, a proud, domineering man with a petrified heart and a burdened conscience. The officers walked silently up and down, casting furtive glances at the entrance of the cabin, fearing that their commander would appear. The sailors did not show up at all. They crouched behind the boats, the spillway, and the water barrels, and whispered their remarks and fears to each other shyly and furtively. An old, bearded sailor, who had sailed 3 times 7 years in the East Indies, lay on the castle sprit in the net of the strong sail, and looked at a younger comrade who sat close below him on the blind yard. "We are avoiding many misfortunes here," said the young sailor from below. "The blowing jacksail means that we cannot be seen from the deck, and the noise in front of the bow drowns out our words. We can talk to each other without shyness, until someone comes over our necks who is strong enough to shut our mouths. Us here in front, and those on the quarterdeck. Here in the table that there is never anything good to be hoped for a sailor, and he is supposed to praise his God, who quickly cuts them with lightly reefed sails. We've been lying in it for 3 days now without moving from the spot, and when he appears, whose name a pious sailor should not pronounce without reciting a prayer, I know," interrupted the other. "You mean Van der Decken, the Flying Dutchman? Hush, you wretched fellow. Well, I guess I'll be able to talk about him. Is his name so dangerous that he will poison you if you put him in your mouth? How is luck with Holland's flag? She will blow as undisturbed from our gaff when Captain Van der Decken is 1,000 miles from us, as when he steers our wake at cannon shot range. Because, my good boss Smart, I just have to tell you that I don't believe much of the story, and think it is more old women's gossip than truth." The bearded sailor turned blood red with rage, and half straightened up. "The plague on your life, you dog. Another blasphemy, and I will give you a kick that will make you fall backwards into the sea. See if you can reach me here with your foot." He held out for a few moments in his dangerous position, but then he swung himself back in and said, "You shall have my ration, Geneva, 2 days in a row, if you will tell me if there is anything in the story of the Flying Dutchman, and what you really know of the story. Just think, 2 rations." The latter could not resist this temptation. He overcame his fear of the ghost ship and began. He studied in rage, stamped his feet, and spoke aloud to himself, but so indistinctly that not a syllable could be understood. He often received an answer from a third party, whose presence no one noticed. And when he spoke, it was a noise, as if all the spirits of hell were being let loose at once. Some even claimed to have felt that it smelled of hellish fire. It is certain that such an attempt was always followed by a violent storm, which put the ship in the greatest danger. When Captain Van der Decken dropped anchor after such a voyage supported by the devil, he went ashore at the same time, and there he taught all the devilry he had learned on the way from the old infernal bristle. "So he did not particularly discipline and honor?" asked the young sailor. "And it is true in the end that he is said to have played strangely with the women." "The devil let him do well with his wickedness," grumbled the other. "He is now paying for it, and will have to pay for it until the end of time." High on the dunes of the North Sea and far away from any inhabited place, he owned a large house. He was up to mischief in it. Inside the well-locked gate sat an old witch woman as a guard. She was more faithful to him and quickly at hand with all malicious advice. When his godfather Horsefoot brought him a fat knowledge from the daughters of the country to atone for his evil lust, the old woman first took it and trained it properly, so that the strict master should have no cause for complaint. The devil is said to have been specially named for this old woman, and has promised to give her the entire rich estate of the master, if he should one day wring his neck. And did the witch get this inheritance? All the gold pieces that the East India Company shows us are such devil's bait, and the honest sailor's blood really falls into the trap. For my part, I plunged into it 4 times now, because a trip to Batavia is nothing but a crusade to hell, from which you return with empty pockets. And the worst trick that plays the devil on you is that in the reckoning every time 0 adds up to 0, and you can say you're lucky if you get a handful of silver gold. But to get back to the Vanderdecken, and to earn my Jennifer at last, bad things were done in the old house, and the girls were so docile to you that they did the most crazy things that were required of them. But such joy did not last long, and when he was tired of a prostitute, he did not give her a handful of gold and send her away. No, he twisted her neck so that she should not divulge how he was doing. When night fell, he put the body in a large sack with the help of his witch. They dragged him to the beach and threw him into the sea. When the sack fell into it and the sea beat over it, the 2 villains laughed aloud, and the devil answered them from afar. Once, however, the thing came to an unexpected end. The devil had again chosen a precious piece for his friend and brought it to him. She was a girl like milk and blood, and the most beautiful thing Vanderdecken had ever seen. The devil had stolen her when she came out of Mass at the same moment that she gave the missal to the waiting servant to carry, for before he had no power over her. It was said that at that moment the maiden was thinking of a great fair, when she was to meet the heart of all her loved ones. Because of this, her mind sank into worldly things and the Mass was forgotten. The devil took advantage of this and led them unseen to the house of Vanderdecken. The old witch made every effort she could with the beautiful child, but she would not succeed. All was in vain, and when the old woman painted the life of sin for her in the most beautiful colors, the Virgin fell on her knees and prayed for deliverance from this misery. Hence the anger of the old woman watched and broke out immeasurably upon the poor child. She struck it and hurried to Vanderdecken to sue him for the recalcitrant prostitute. The latter also flew into a rage and ran to the hall where the pious maiden was to chastise her also. But when he caught sight of her and noticed the holy glow that emanated from her, a softer feeling took possession of him, and he tried to irritate her with friendly words. But whatever arts he might try, it was all fruitless, for she would rather tear her body to pieces with her nails than admit that he touched him with his unholy hands. Then Vanderdecken became 3 times more angry, and beside himself he cried, "If you resist the request of a man who for the first time degraded himself to such cowardice, we will see what power can do over you. Stand by me, witch woman, we will show you what happens to him who resists the will of Vanderdecken." And no sooner had he spoken these words than they both fell upon the poor creature and beat her miserably. She could not endure this barbaric treatment for long, but sank dead at the feet of her tormentors. Vanderdecken almost distorted himself with anger at this, and poured all his anger on the necks of his sorcerers. But then they sewed this maiden into a sack and carried her to the sea. "That's a horrible story, Chef Smart," said the young sailor, shaking himself. "How is it next?" The bearded man continued, "I want to finish it." So they dragged the body to the beach and threw it into the sea. This time they did not laugh at it, but the devil laughed all the louder, for he is a fine fellow, and he might well have noticed that he now had his friend Vanderdecken by the hair. Scarcely, however, had the devil's laughter healed when a clear ringing was heard, and though the sky was shrouded in gloomy clouds, yet a bright glow spread over the sea, as if it were illuminated by the moon. And at that moment the corpse of the pious maiden emerged from the waves, her pale face turned to Vanderdecken, and incessantly crying out to him the words, "Follow me, follow me." He was so enraged that he would have thrown himself headlong into the sea, if the witch had not restrained him by force with the devil's good support, for he had intended a far worse end for him. So he whispered to the half-senseless captain that the maiden was not dead at all, and that he could save her for his pleasure if he only wanted to. Scarcely had the devil said this than a large ship became visible, which Vanderdecken had not seen before, and when he looked closer, he discovered that it was his own. Now he was driven on board, and no sooner had he crossed the halyard than all the saws on the mast rose up, as if of their own accord. But he ordered to follow the bright glow that was contending for the young girl's head, and which he alone saw. So he drifted through the North Sea, through the Channel, past the Peg of Tenerife, through the wide Atlantic Ocean. The crew had been not a little surprised at such a speedy departure, and the officers humbly ventured to ask about it. But they received no answer but a curse, and that a girl's head was dancing before them on the sea, which was surrounded by a holy light, and which he must have. When the men heard such a statement, they pulled out their axes and went to one side, for they could not help believing that their captain had lost his mind, and they were already careful to depose him. So they now reached the table at just the point where we are and where fear overwhelmed the narrator once more. He paused and looked around him in all directions. The sun is sinking lower and lower, and soon it will be pitch dark. Then is the time when the evil Vanderdecken shows up. So let us end quickly. He now reached the table, and here the trouble really began. The wind blew violently against him. Weeks and months passed without him being able to cross the bay. Sometimes the ship lay on starboard, now on port jibes, but always drifted backwards during the entrance as much as she had gained in the previous one, and all the trouble and work had been in vain. Then Vanderdecken was seized with a tremendous rage. He blasphemed the name of God and cried, "Now I will sail here until the end of all days. If I am to be a terror and horror to myself, I will also be a terror to all those who steer in my wake, as long as the wind blows and the crows." And no sooner had he spoken these words than the, which was in the hens, began to crow loudly. At the same moment a violent storm broke out, and the ship rushed almost to one side, tossed along with such rapidity as is still seen by the children of misfortune who have the fate of cutting its wake. The young sailor, who had been a very attentive listener, shook himself with fear, for he had heard elsewhere that he who crosses the Flying Dutchman's wake cuts through the voyages of life, and he softly repeated to himself Vanderdecken's words, "As long as the wind blows and the crows." The boatswain's pipe interrupted the conversation of the two sailors. The wind had cleared a bit, and the yards were blown up. No sooner had order been restored than Captain Klaus von Bellum stepped onto the deck of Gelderland. He saluted his officers with a sullen nod of his head, and then began to pack up and down the quarter-deck, according to his custom. Everywhere was his eye, and everywhere he found something to blame. The officers received either open reprimands or ironic praise. The sailors were sent to the highest peak to carry out the captain's whims. The quickest obedience to the orders was not enough to conquer the displeasure of the master, but this growth, and those who came near him, were certainly the most emphatic proofs of receiving his discontent. On the slab mast of the foremast, two young top guests met who had been sent here to the lookout. "Do you hear the thunderstorm below us, Jancha? Hear it? It's just as if you're standing on a mountain. There is lightning and thunder beneath you, too." "Yes, maybe. I've never been on a mountain, except for the hamburger. But there was no thunder and lightning, but there was drumming and trumpeting." "What the hell is going on again? Don't you know?" The captain carries in his chest a kind of thing called conscience. As big as it is, the little thing is bigger and needs to be treated subtly. That's why he prefers it best when it sleeps peacefully. But now the insolent thing wakes up from time to time, and then it is said to pinch and pinch him mercilessly. Tell me, what did your mother do when you were a little child, and she wanted to put you to sleep? She sang something to me. That's how he does it down there. He sings to his people so much about the devil and the thunderstorm, until the conscience lets the pincers rest. What's the deal with the bad conscience? Is it true that he had a pretty wife? That's right. She was so beautiful that she was called the Eye of Brabant, because she was born in Brabant. She also carried her husband on his hands, but he didn't take much care of her and always treated her harshly and briefly. The poor woman was grieved at this, and avoided him. One day, when the captain unexpectedly enters the garden, he sees his wife sitting in an arbor, and at her side a man who hides his face from one of the beautiful woman's breasts. He is said to have been very angry with gall and wine, or he would have looked a little closer. But the devil already had his claws in his claws, so he drew his sword and stabbed both of them through and through, all weathers. Through and through, I tell you. And the consequence of this was that a few days later he had to bury his wife and her father. Stop with your story. I'm gripped by dizziness. Don't be a sewing borscher. It's already over. Do you now know why his conscience burns like the fire of hell? This is not a fire that can be extinguished so easily. Didn't they punish him for his misdeed? Something has changed. Sir, Clay Zabellum is a rich man of respect, and rich men of respect are always right. He was taken into custody, but the doctors intervened and said, "Broad boy, you shall hear that I have gone through high school, and you shall have respect for myself." They said he was suffering from momentary insanity and could not harm him. "A sail, a sail," shouted the lookout man from the big top. The two Vordup men started up from their sailing in fright at this call. Their gaze wanders over the horizon, and immediately afterwards they also shouted, "A sail." It was already dawn. The mists were brewing on the sea and made the view into the distance uncertain. High in the air you could see something white trembling on the waves. It could be a sail, but it could also be some mirage. In a few minutes it was completely gone. The team was in turmoil. The cry of a sail had pierced the sailors' bones. They already saw the damned Vanderdecken approaching them and dragging themselves into the abyss. Everywhere people put their heads together. There was an eerie whisper everywhere. "If it's him, we'll have alongside in an hour." And then he launches a boat. He always does. And mercy on us, God. When he comes on board, he brings letters, as we can take our breath out when ordering them. Damn be my eagerness to board this hopeless ship. Now I have to go into the mouth of the devil and can't get married to my dearest one. There was also some excitement on the half-deck. The officers glanced meaningfully at each other. The captain came up to them. Do the officers want to follow the sailors, who have all lost their minds and are looking for a ghost that haunts nowhere but their brains? "Yes, Captain," replied the first officer, an old storm-proof sailor. "The murder has banished the Flying Dutchman to the volatile element, and he easily smells blood. I am not one of those strong spirits who want to deny everything that goes beyond their horizon, and I will never think of denying the existence of that sinister ship. Let him come, but I will face him firmly and calmly, for I have an unburdened conscience." The captain bit his lips and walked hastily up and down. The officers awaited with cold resignation the outburst of anger of their master. "A sail! A sail!" it cried again, and the same ghostly white stripe flew away in the air. "Boatswain!" cried the captain in a loud voice. "Watch out for the people. the first one who shouted again that a sail should be tied to the mast and whipped until he ran out of breath. Silence everywhere. For every word that comes out of the unwashed mouth of a sailor, a dozen blows with the cat. Grave silence reigned on board the East Indiaman. With silent and timid glances, the people crept past each other. Dark mist swayed on the waves. Night fell ominously. A young officer, a relative of the captain, at last ventured to address him. He received a short, insulting reply. The latter replied briskly. The exchange of words became more violent, and the captain shouted beside himself, "Put the rebel in chains." The young officer came very close to him. "I am surprised that you exercised the judgment on the non-standing foot and sent me to where you sent my unfriend and your wife. Should it happen again in momentary madness, all the blood would leave the captain's face." His hands clenched convulsively, and the foam came to his mouth. He reached for the dagger. One push, and the young man lay gasping on the ground. A cry of horror escaped the officers, who rushed to the aid of their dying comrades. "Jesus, Mary, and Joseph," shouted a young Portuguese man who was high on the line, pointing with his hand in front of him. Through the darkness, the shapeless form of a gigantic ship became visible, swaying and swaying noiselessly before the bow of Gelderland. It was the Flying Dutchman. With silent horror, the sailors stared at the ominous apparition, which moved slowly and finally disappeared in the fog. The captain retired to his cabin. The officers stood huddled together in a heap and consulted with each other, while some intrepid topmen, under the guidance of the boatswain, carried the young man's body below deck. People were running around in great disorder. No admonition, no order from the bow officers could put them to rest. They refused to obey and prepared to respond to violence with violence. So the night passed, and the dawning morning found the riot in full swing. But when the first ray of the day flew over the decking, the anger gave way to the pale faces. Then the ghostly ship of the dreadful Vanderdecken stretched out before them on the waves, and his sloop pushed overboard. Officers and sailors watched this spectacle motionless with horror. Only the captain looked defiantly around him. There was no fear on his face, and half threateningly, half mockingly, he cried over the blanket, "Have a strong rope ready to throw to this fellow. We want to hear what he has to say to us." This order was not obeyed, for they all stared at the sloop, which glided over the waves without a rudder, and headed straight for the Gelderland. Only one man was in it, and started the ship with a steady gaze. For the first time a feeling of fear crept into the captain's heart, and he failed to give his order due force. His eye, too, was fixed on the sloop, which now grazed the bow and lay on it, as if tied to the gangway of the starboard. The sailor who was in it climbed up the deck, went straight up to the captain, who had placed himself at the head of his officers, and asked in a hollow, grave voice, "Who are you, and where do you come from?" "We come from Amsterdam. This is the ship Gelderland, and I am Klaas van Bellum, the commander of it." "Klaas van Bellum, you will be so good as to take these letters that my captain, Minerve Vanderdecken, sends you to Holland, and get them conscientiously." "What do you think? What am I to get these letters? Now I'm sailing to Batavia, and I'm not going back to Amsterdam for another 7 years. A short deadline. You are still returning earlier than we are, because we cross here in the table and always find the end. Take the letters." The tone of the ghostly sailor was so urgent, so pitiful and terrible at the same time. The glance he had at the captain confused him so much that he stretched out his hand and accepted the letters, to the great horror of all. At this moment a tall figure rose above the gallery of the ghost ship. She spread out her arms as if in greeting. Then she brought the mouthpiece to her mouth and called across the sea, "Hello to the homeland," and immediately afterward she had disappeared again. "This is Vanderdecken," said the ghostly sailor. "He only sends a greeting to those whom he considers particularly worthy of this honor." and when he had said that, he had disappeared from the deck in his sloop from the halyard. The ghost ship, however, seemed to sink into the abyss before the eyes of the whole crew. The captain still held the letters in front of him and read, "To the Honorable Merchantman Herbjørn van der Staken, Resident Stubenwijk 3. The first officer interrupted him. "The House Baron van Staken has already been lost, and Stubenwijk has been torn down for more than 100 years to build a new church on this site. You see, the Flying Dutchman has been on board with us after all, and we are lost." The breaking storm swallowed up his words and brought such excitement to the Tafelbayern that within a few minutes Schiff was deprived of the utmost danger. Heavy storm clouds descended lower and lower and shone around with their lightning. The cry of distress of the crew was unheard today in the roar of the storm. The ship Gelderland never arrived in Batavia. I hope you liked the story and are interested in more stories here on our channel. If you liked it, please subscribe to our channel and click on the bell so you don't miss any new stories in the future. We would of course be very happy if you like it.